There are people who choose to make a positive difference in the world. Our job is to bring you their stories to motivate you to do the same. Join us each week, host John Alexander and Naima Latif, as we bring you the educators, entertainers, elected officials, religious leaders, and community activists whose works are transforming this world. Find out how you can make a difference too. Be inspired. Watch The Media Connection.
Jonathan is not only a professor of economics at Chicago State, he is a history scholar as well, having drawn many of these papers together to interpret this season. I must say that much of my consciousness, frankly, comes from my children. A book written by Jesse Jackson Jr. and Jonathan's very detailed research on the forces that led up to this singular moment. I've asked him today to be the interpreter of this document and this event for us. Jonathan Jackson.
Let us bow our heads for a moment, please. We thank God for 150 years. Let's take the time to remember all those souls that have died, sacrificed, that we may be here today. Nameless, faceless people that lost their possessions, lost their lives. They believed in humanity. They believed in freedom for all. We thank God for their blessed memory. Amen. Honored to be with you today. I thank my father, Reverend Jesse Jackson. I thank all of you that came out today. Give yourself a loving, wonderful round of applause. Why are we here? We're here to commemorate 150 years. We're only talking about 15,365 days ago. Just 15,365 days ago. There was a vision for this nation in 1619 of an opportunity for freed men to come from Europe, settle our land. Somewhere along the way, greed had overtaken our land. So when you ask the question, go home, whose home is this anyway? This was Native American land. The Native Americans did not recognize property rights. Native Americans did not see you being able to own a parcel of land. They did not see that you could own the water rights. They did not see that you could own the curbs and the streets and thus jack up the rates on the parking meters. Back to the message at hand today. They thought it was everybody's land.
And I'm here with Gene Lockett, noted playwright and television personality. Now, you have a creative way of teaching. How are you going to teach this message of history to the young people that you work with through your plays?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I am really, truly excited to hear what was being said in regards to our history. And it's amazing of so many things that we are not aware of. But in regards to what was taught, it's just researching myself, taking the information that we have and not reinventing the wheel, but just sharing what has been shared with us.
All right. Well, you do a great job, and thanks for being one of those people who help get the word out.
Oh, yes. I'm really excited, and I want to thank my brother for having my husband and I come out at this time and hear the information that we've heard.
All right. And we want to hear more from you, and we'll be looking forward to your next play.
Oh, yes. I want you all to come out and hear it. So it will be Black History. So some of this information we will be sharing.
All right.
All right.
We'll be right back.
Go forward 244 years to the time that we shall focus on of 1863. Only God can count how many seeds one apple will be able to produce. We can all see how many seeds are in an apple, but only God can tell us how many apples will be in one seed. This is the life of Abraham Lincoln, a man that was born in Kentucky, a rural young man. Go back in 1861, in 1863. The activity in the state and the population of Illinois was heavily populated in southern Illinois. It wasn't a Chicago as we know of it today. And there was a young man, Stephen Douglas, that had a visceral tongue and a hot temperament that found Abraham Lincoln to be a clumsy 6'4", very inarticulate man. Many people looked at Abraham Lincoln as a failure in so many ways of his life. He lost at most things he had set out to do. With his beautiful wife, Miss Mary Todd Lincoln, by his side, an honest heart, God can use you to do great things. Abraham Lincoln was exalted, became president of the United States. He was from the state of Illinois, and a very unusual state. Illinois is neither a free state nor a slave state. Illinois is a state that had voluntary servitude, meaning you could choose to be in slavery after 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. These events led up, if you will, to the signing of this document that we're here to commemorate today, the Emancipation Proclamation. Let us focus on that for the next few moments. And why do we need an Emancipation Proclamation? America was born with a congenital birth defect. It professed freedoms for all, physical, political freedoms, but it enslaved some of its own citizens. It's a contradiction in terms. It's paradoxical, if you will, to espouse freedom and harbor slavery. We first must focus on 1772. Some would like to think it's 1776 when we hear about the Declaration of Independence. But keep in mind, we were a colony of the British government. And there were 3 points I want to leave with you today, and one of which has to deal with George Washington, the second of which has to deal with Abraham Lincoln, and the third has to deal with the Reverend Martin Luther King. The first part of 1772, we've heard of 1776, and we've seen the vestiges now of the Tea Party, and we've been told of we're not going to have taxation without representation. Well, what was the most valuable thing in America in 1772? It were human beings, people that you could get free labor out of. I don't like to use the term slaves. These were human beings that had been enslaved. Slave is not a person. Slave is a condition. People that had been enslaved. The British government did not want the Americans, their baby colony, coming over to their lands with the slaves, those that have been enslaved, because they said they had bad attitudes, and you're throwing off our program over here. So in turn, there was a young man that became very popular, Mr. Somerset. It's the Somerset case that we should be taught of in our history. That there was a couple, if you will, an abolitionist couple, that took in Mr. Somerset because his master was going to send him to the islands to be beaten. This young man had won his way into the hearts of good-willed people in the United Kingdom. They took him to the courts, gave him safe harbor, and they won his freedom. That is what triggered the event of the Boston Tea Party. Because this new colony that was trying to make money, that was greedy, says, you've made money off these people. We want to have our own opportunity to raise cotton, raise sugar, raise tobacco, and we need that same free labor. That is when America revolted. And that is what we know as the first revolution in 1776, our War of Independence. Now, the reason I mentioned George Washington's name, George Washington had a dream, not just Martin Luther King. George Washington did not come from a family of enormous wealth. George Washington earned his money the old-fashioned way. He married it. He married into wealth. And thank God for touching General George Washington, not elected, but selected, to end up becoming the first president of our government. He, in turn, had a dream 3 days before he died. He rewrote his will. And he wanted all of those that were enslaved on their plantation, he and Martha's, to be set free.
Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Something touched his heart. This is why we know the name in our culture of Washingtons. Coming from a people that had no names at all that was taken from them. We adopted because we heard rumor of a great man named George Washington. Well, call me George. This is why the Pullman Porters were named George. This is why we have Washington schools and streets. A great man we have to remember for what he did. He in turn made all of his estate go over to his wife Martha. Martha in turn was to live out the rest of her days with this free labor. And in turn, all of those that worked for him were to be freed, manumitted, released. But a problem came up. All of those that had been enslaved knew of this. Oh my goodness. After George Washington died, and his property, human beings, were to be turned over to his wife, they finally would be set free after Martha's passing. The story goes that Mrs. Washington was coming back to her estate one day and saw people having a good time, laughing, joking, and she overheard someone while she was in the house saying, as soon as she dies, we shall be set free. Well, Mrs. Washington hastily changed her plans, came outside and said, all of you all are free, because I'm not planning on dying no time soon. This is the story of George Washington, but we thank God that he used this man as the president. And that was the first revolution, if you will, when we changed our relationship with a British government. We were no longer a colony, we were an independent nation. Let's go forward to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had to make a big decision. Should I keep slavery and keep the Union? Should I force those Southerners that have currently succeeded? Because his predecessor already said there will be no United States of America after me. Abraham Lincoln had taken the helm of a two-headed ship and a house that had been already divided. What was the division? The division is, if you can imagine, on most balance sheets and expense statements today, 1/3 of our expenses is in labor. Can you imagine running a corporation without 1/3 of your expenses? You could be profitable. But if you have to pay people, then you may look at yourself as losing money. So now when you see the issue of Abraham Lincoln having to fight with the Southerners, and they had already succeeded. Mr. Jefferson Davis out of Montgomery, Alabama. Mr. Alexander Stephens out of Georgia, who put down in his vice presidential remarks that African in America were inferior in God's sight. Look it up. It's in the Cornerstone speech. And he goes into great detail to tell us what he thought about us. And this was Jefferson Davis's running mate. So Abraham Lincoln says, You can keep slavery, just come back to the Union. But Jefferson Davis and Mr. Alexander Stephens had a different vision. They wanted to have the Confederate States of America. They wanted to colonize throughout the South, through Mexico, and through the Caribbean. They wanted to have an agrarian-based economy where they could have fruits and coconuts and cotton and corn. And they were seeking recognition from the British government and the French government. Thank God for those administrators, lawmakers in France and Britain that would not give them recognition. They had already printed their own constitution, already printed their own currency. When you have a country, you have to get recognition. Because those two countries would not give them recognition is the reason the Confederate States of America also did not succeed. Abraham Lincoln says, I'll take you, I just want to preserve the Union. But somewhere along the way, Abraham Lincoln could see this isn't about you being able to have your own autonomy and run your own companies and have your own business. There was new territory opening up in Kansas and Missouri, and the language was getting very sophisticated and tricky, such as involuntary servitude. Here's what the issue was. The issue was if you have free labor and you can transport those people to another land, now you can set up, if you will, your manufacturing, your production in a new territory to acquire new wealth. The time had come to stop the portability, the transportation of human beings, extending human bondage. So this is what started the battles in Missouri and Kansas very specifically. You had half free states, half states that had recognized slavery. So the decision for Mr. Lincoln, he was looking for a win. We were losing in the Civil War. The Southerners could use those that had been enslaved as their labor to cook and run their facilities. They could still make money while the men went off to fight. The Northern men had to work in factories and had to fight, so we were outnumbered. The largest body of history and population at that time in our country was in the South, not in the North.
And I'm here with Don Harris, a longtime supporter of Rainbow Push and somebody who's got a lot of history inside of him. Now, you heard this information about the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. How do you feel that we progressed here at Push since that time of our liberation?
Well, I think the progression has been slow, but I learned a lot today that I never knew before, including about John Brown, the whole bit. We have to keep up on our history just to know where we came from.
Yes. What motivates you to keep coming back to Push and keep serving the way you do?
Well, I started in the movement when I was 15, 16 years old. Been 48 years since that time. It's just the fact that there's a need. We have to keep this movement going. We have to keep it going, pass it down to our young folks, to our kids.
Do you have children also you're teaching?
2 kids and 2 grandkids, and I'm going to teach them everything that I can before I go.
All right. Thank you so much.
This is when Antietam came about. And he used that opportunity to say, I've told you I want to preserve the Union. And as a matter of punishment, I will free those in those territories that you have put in bondage. This is what started the Battle Hymn of the Republic march that we know of today. How does the Battle Hymn of the Republic come into being? We know the story. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the come. He is standing. Yep. Reverend wants me to sing it. But I love that song. But prior to that song, hi, Miss Opal. Prior to that song, it was a folk song. Where do folk songs come from? Folk songs come from folks. And how do folks create a song? It's something that's stirring up in their soul. There was a time for freedom, true freedom, to be born. What happened was there was a young man This is a tapestry, and this is a 3-part cord that all comes together. And it may not believe what you currently think, but I want to leave you here with the truth. We're proud of our ancestry and history from the Mayflower. What if I told you that a man that's been vilified in recent years, Mr. John Brown, what if I told you that man was a shepherd from Pennsylvania? What if I told you that man's father was one of the founders of Oberlin College in Ohio? What if I told you that that man, his great-great-grandfather, his ancestry comes from the Mayflower? What if I told you he went up to the abolitionist meeting to meet Gerrit Smith and William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Tubman and stayed in the house of Frederick Douglass, and because of the death of Eli Lovejoy from Lovejoy County in the state of Illinois, he gathered up arms and went to Kansas, and after African Americans and innocent Caucasians, laborers were murdered by those that were marauders like Jesse James, went back to Missouri after voter suppression, ballot box stuffing, the same games from then, the same games now. When he picked up arms, and his military strategy was, let those that have lost their wives to slavery, let those that have lost their children, let those that don't have a last name because of this birth defect that we have that is crippling the human spirit, let those pick up arms and fight for themselves. It's the Second Amendment right, you know. They're God's children, you know. This is where the folk song, John Brown's body came a-marching, and his soul is marching on. John Brown was a great man throughout American history. There was from 1861 to 1869 commemorative days of celebration for the life of John Brown in England. His wife was honored in France, as well as Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, in France. Moving right along on Abraham Lincoln. This proclamation of emancipation was anticipated for 244 years. My father said it so eloquently. Blacks waited up all night long, praying that the man would do what he said he was going to do. That a promise made by a politician was going to be a promise fulfilled. Thank God for keeping Abraham Lincoln safe and alive to honor his promise. We're here 150 years later, just 15,365 days. When we think of Abraham Lincoln, let's not look at where he started. Let's look at where he ended. When we celebrate the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, the abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude, we still have some more fights on our hands. Prison labor is nothing but slavery redisguised by another name in 2013 called voluntary servitude. Then we had the 14th Amendment so that we could make sure we had equal enforcement of the law. This is the challenge of our time right now. We need equal enforcement of the laws. What laws am I talking about? For example, you know banks are very close to my heart. If you're the director of a failed depository financial institution, it's on the law. It's on the books. You're not supposed to still be on the board of a bank. What's holding back our recovery? What's holding back the refinancing of our homes? We have to now go back to the same people that overcharged us, that stayed alive because of welfare, because of subsidies, because of handouts, that have been dressed up, called bailouts, and they refuse to modify our loans. We need equal protection, equal enforcement of the law. And more importantly, then we have the privilege of having the 15th Amendment of our right to vote ensured only after we enforce the laws. In conclusion, in whose house we stand today, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. These first two gentlemen, they achieved a revolution, a change in social relationships by picking up arms. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Reverend Martin Luther King taught us he could have a revolution by changing fundamentally the relationship, not from the U.S. to Britain, not from the North and the South, but from men to men, man to man, woman to woman, black to white, making this truly a land welcoming, a home for the poor, the oppressed from all over the world. He did it by opening up his arms, not picking up an arm. We're in the Rainbow Push headquarters of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s workshop on this 150th year anniversary. We're asking God to see favor in our work. We want to uphold the memory. We want to thank God for all those that died along the way. It was black and white. Let us not forget the name of Senator Sumner's. Senator Charles Sumner, the architect in so many ways of the 14th Amendment, was beaten down on the Senate floors with a gutta percha cane because he said slavery was wrong. We have to thank God for General Fremont. We're proud to see Howard University. Howard University is not after an African American. Right. It's after General Howard, a great abolitionist. We're proud to see Sheridan Road. Yes, that's a Caucasian man. Right. We're proud to see the history. The main street in Haiti on Port-au-Prince is John Brown Way, a man that they've honored who led the way, who sacrificed his family and children. We want the truth out. When we are so proud of Spelman College, we thank God, but Spelman is not an African-American woman. She's the wife of Mr. Rockefeller, who went to school with some African-American women, and when the school was going bankrupt, they wrote to her. She told her husband she wanted to buy the land to give to those women at that Negro female college. We've had black and white help all along the way. It was called slave trade. I want to thank God for the memory of Reverend Martin Luther King on changing that last part to create a three-legged stool in America for our humanity. We've changed our relationship from a British colony, from Northern and Southern, and now amongst black and white. Give Reverend Martin Luther King a loving round of applause.
We must go to school boards and to churches that they might adopt in the part of their teaching and display the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which driven by the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, which drove the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, is the most fundamental shift in American policy, politically and morally, because we were half slave and half free. We set the pace for the whole world when that was open. And so we of all people must remove not the ancient landmark of ending 244 years of slavery. Also, don't forget, we were enslaved longer than we have been free. We've been free technically 150 years, but we were enslaved 244 years. So we're still in the early morning of our quest for freedom.
150 years ago, we were fighting for our freedom. We've come so far, but we've got so far to go. So let's continue to keep that dream alive, and let's continue to send the message to our young people that the fight is not over. I'm your host, Naima Latif, for the Media Connection. We'll see you again next time.